Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here for another installment of What History Teaches: The Rise of Nazism. This series of webinars is held in partnership with the Holocaust Resource Center of Buffalo, Holocaust Museum LA, the Montreal Holocaust Museum, the Seattle Holocaust Center for Humanity, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, Echoes and Reflections, Holocaust Education Resource Council, and the Ninth Candle. Thank you to all of our partners for their continuing support of this program. My name is Haley Wells, and I am the program manager at the Alabama Holocaust Education Center. Before we begin, I would like to go over a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees will be kept on mute for the duration of the program. Today's discussion will be followed by a Q&A, and you can ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. Today's presentation comes at a crucial moment in our history when the lessons of the past are desperately needed to combat contemporary iterations of hate, division, and extremism. Our discussion about the progression of Nazi laws, moving from a democracy to a dictatorship and then perpetuating genocide, will be presented by Professor Mansfield. Cathy Lesser Mansfield is a professor of law. She has served on the faculties of Drake University Law School, Georgetown Law School, Case Western Reserve University, and Washburn University. Professor Mansfield was a Silberman Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and is a Distinguished Fellow at the Consortium for the Research and Study of Holocaust in the Law at Chicago-Kent College of Law's Center for National Security and Human Rights Law. She is also the founder and was the executive director of the Sparks Fly Upward, a nonprofit organization that operated until 2024 and was dedicated to educating people about the Holocaust, genocide, and tolerance through presentations of Sparks and ancillary activities. Without further ado, over to you, Professor Mansfield.
And I guess we should say Sparks is actually an opera about the Holocaust, and the foundation worked in conjunction with that. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I am going to try to cover in about 45 or 50 minutes um, the laws that allowed the Nazi dictatorship the Weimar Republic to convert to the Nazi dictatorship, some of the key anti-Jewish laws, and also some changes that were made to the court systems in Germany, all of which contributed to the sort of terrors of the Nazi regime. It's a tall order, and so I've cut down. So this is like often three different hour-long talks. So I apologize if I'm going very fast, and I'm going to have to cut some stuff out, but I am going to try to do sort of the big overview. For those of you that don't know, Germany was, starting in 1871, an imperial monarchy. There were three Kaisers who were in charge, or the monarchs, for the German monarchy. And at the end of World War I, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who was the last of the three Kaisers, abdicated, and left kind of a big hole in what form of government Germany was going to have after World War I. World War I itself was carried out under the Kaiser. It was fought off German soil, and of course they didn't have Zoom back then, or FaceTime, or cell phones, or anything. And so many of the German people thought that the war was going better than it was actually going. And so it was quite shocking to them when they lost the war, especially given a lot of the sacrifices on the home front, including a lot of hunger and a lot of deaths of husbands and sons. And so at the end of World War I, in addition to having this big governmental hole, you also had this notion that started to develop that the reason Germany had lost the war was not because they were unsuccessful militarily, but because the German people had been stabbed in the back by communists and Jews. And in other words, it had been lost on the home front from the inside. This built on years and decades and centuries of anti-Semitism that I won't go into here, but it was certainly consistent with some of the previous anti-Semitism that had existed. So in the governmental breach, the majority party at the time was the Social Democratic Party, and they had to have some form of government. And so they created this Council of People's Deputies, which was made of three Social Democrats and three independents, in order to create the new government that would take over after the exile of the Kaiser. At the end of on November 11th, the armistice ending World War I was signed. That's why we celebrate Veterans Day on that day. Germany was represented by Friedrich Ebert, who was the leader of creating what became the Weimar government. And then very, very soon after, so that was in November of 18, in January of 1919, the German voters elected a national assembly. They met in the city of Weimar, and their task was to draft a constitution for this new form of government. And so they did. They drafted this constitution. The Constitution, I'm going to go over some of the provisions in the Constitution in a moment. But there was some feeling in Germany that the government that emerged from the Kaiser's absence was illegitimate because it was kind of created from whole cloth. On the other hand, it was created by representatives elected to this constitutional convention. The Treaty of Versailles was signed in June of 1919, and again, it was the founders of the Weimar government who signed the Treaty of Versailles. And so, as the Treaty of Versailles was viewed as onerous by Germans, they also blamed that on the new government. So between 1918, which was the end of World War I, and January of 33, when Hitler became chancellor, there was a lot of political unrest. There was a lot of economic unrest. In terms of political unrest, you had basically armed uprisings on both the extreme left and the extreme right politically. And then, of course, there was a lot of, you've probably all seen the someone going to a bakery with a wheelbarrow full of money in order to get a loaf of bread. There was tremendous inflation in the early years of the Weimar Republic. So there were a lot of challenges that they were facing. And then, of course, in the late 1929 to 30, they were brought into the worldwide Great Depression that was affecting us and everyone else. So on August 11th, the Weimar Constitution, sorry, August 11th of 1919, and hang on a second, I'm having trouble forwarding my slides. Haley, I am unable to forward my slides.
Why don't you try unsharing and then resharing
Okay.
again?
Oh, no, that's weird. It's showing that I'm not sharing. Sorry,
Um,
technical difficulties. Hang on.
it is all right. Let's see. No, because I can see your title slide. So on your end, it's
Can you,
showing that you're not sharing?
can you see it now?
Yes.
Okay, good.
I just saw it when you moved it forward.
Okay, we're fixed. Cool. Okay, so the Constitution was signed into law on August 11th of 1919. It was structured with a lot of checks and balances like our Constitution, but with some differences. Interestingly enough, it gave women the vote. So this was a year before our 19th Amendment gave women in the United States a vote. And it had the following features. So it had a president who was elected by popular vote for a term of 7 years. The check on that was that the president could be recalled by popular vote or by the Reichstag, which was one of the two legislative bodies, which I'll talk about in a minute. There were only two presidents during the entire Weimar Republic, which went from 1919 until 1933. And that was only because the first president, Friedrich Ebert, the same guy who founded the Weimar Republic, died in office in 1925. And then Paul von Hindenburg, who had been a general, a very well-known general, was appointed after him or elected after him. And Hindenburg actually helped facilitate the transition to the dictatorship. He was very old by the time Hitler came into power, but he ended up actually facilitating the transition. Then there was the role of chancellor, which was a political appointment by the president. The chancellor, which is the role that Hitler would eventually play, presided over the government, conducted the political program of the German Reich. And that was not so stable. There was a series of chancellors, 14 of them. A couple of them served more than once, but not consecutively. And by 1932, which was the year before Hitler went into power, There were, just in that one year, there were three chancellors. So it was a fairly unstable position, and it reflected some of the unstable politics. There was a cabinet made up of Reich ministers, and then there were two houses of parliament. One was the Reichstag, which was sort of the equivalent of our House of Representatives. They were elected by universal, equal, direct, and secret suffrage by men and women over 20. And then this is a sort of fatal, I guess, or one of the fatal flaws, was that seats were allotted based on proportional representation. So they had a certain number of population that would equal one seat. I don't remember what the number was. I think it was about 60 or 70,000. And so if the population expanded, the number of seats in the Reichstag would expand. And if the population declined, the number of seats would decline. And as long as somebody got one chunk of votes, that party would get one seat in the Reichstag. And of course, that meant that you ended up with a lot of different parties with small numbers of representatives, which made it very, very difficult to cobble together a majority to actually run the government. And, we've seen this in our modern day too. Israel's had this, so that's one of the risks of proportional representation. Another feature of the Constitution was that the president could dissolve the Reichstag for any reason one time. So in other words, each reason could only be used once. And then there had to be a new election on the 60th day after dissolution. Then there was another body called the Reichsrat, and that was more like our Senate, except it wasn't direct representation. It was elected by the parliaments of the 18 German states. The legislative process, it's not necessary to really go through all the ins and outs. Let's just say they definitely had checks and balances. Things were adopted by the Reichstag. They could be protested by the Reichsrat. There was an ability to override by vote. The president could call for a popular referendum to eliminate laws that had been passed by the Reichstag. So there was a role to be played by everybody in the process of passing laws. And then this is a translation of the Weimar Constitution from the Nuremberg trials immediately after the war. So what were the problems with the Reichstag? I'm sorry, with the Weimar Constitution. The biggest one, and rest assured, we don't have anything quite like this in our Constitution, was Article 48 of the Constitution, which the author Benjamin Hett, whose books I highly recommend, called the trapdoor through which Germany could fall into a dictatorship. And in fact, it was the trapdoor that Germany fell through into a dictatorship. It allowed the Reich president to, if there was public order and security are seriously disturbed or endangered, the president may take the measures necessary for the restoration, intervening if necessary with the aid of the armed forces. For this purpose, he may temporarily abrogate, wholly or in part, and then it lists other sections of the Constitution, including the right to personal liberty, which was abrogated at the beginning of the dictatorship, the right to sanctuary in your house, secrecy of communications, freedom of expression, right to assembly, right to non-criminal association, and right to private property. You'll see in a minute when I talk about the Hitler dictatorship how this served as the basis for the dictatorship. And then this worked also with the dissolution of the Reichstag. So basically, the Article 48 allowed the Reichstag to annul any action taken by the president under Article 48, but then Article 25 allowed the president to dissolve the Reichstag one time for any reason. So basically, if the Reichstag took their role in dissolving a presidential decree under Article 48, the president, if he was dissatisfied with that, would just dissolve the Reichstag and would be allowed to rule by decree for 60 days while new elections were held. So that was also an issue in the Weimar Republic. And then also this proportional representation made it very difficult to cobble together a majority. Um, I think it's important to note. So I, for a long time, thought about the dictatorship as sort of this hard start with the day that Hitler was appointed chancellor. But in fact, things were falling apart earlier, and particularly in 1932. Um, so first of all, the law that made Hitler basically that started to fold other aspects of government into his role was called the enabling law. And there had actually twice been enabling laws in 1923 that allowed the president to issue decrees regarding substantive law, even if they violated the Constitution. And they did not have a judicial review of constitution for constitutionality the way we do. 1923 was probably the worst year economically for Germany, and so I'm sure that had something to do with that. And then, as you can see by this chart on the bottom, Article 48, which allowed the president to issue decrees and run by decrees, was used more and more frequently as time went on. And the Reichstag, which was the legislative body, was passing less and less legislation. So you can see in 1932, Hindenburg used Article 48 59 times, and there were only 5 pieces of legislation passed that year. So things were starting to really unravel in 1932, and that very much led to the appointment of Hitler, which was a political compromise that in order to both form a government and also try and get things under control. Lastly, at least I think this is lastly, the Constitution could be amended. Um, and this was kind of an interesting provision. The Constitution could be amended if 2/3 of the members of the Reichstag were present and 2/3 of those present consented to the change. So if you do the math on that, that means that the Constitution can be amended by only 44% of the Reichstag, which is not even a simple majority. And this comes into play in a minute when I talk about things that happened later on. Um, Okay, so just briefly, the Nazi Party itself was founded in 1919. It never before the dictatorship, achieved more than a 37% share of seats in the Reichstag. And actually, there were 2 elections in 1932, and it actually declined in representation between July and November 32. It lost 5% of their seats. Hitler became chancellor on January 30th of 1933. Again, there have been whole books written about why Hitler was chosen. Hindenburg actually opposed having Hitler as chancellor at first, but it seemed to be the only basically possible way to keep the government together. And then things started to unravel pretty quickly after Hitler was appointed as chancellor. So first of all, Hitler basically went to Hindenburg and said, I want to have a new election right away. So what was Hitler thinking at this point? He was probably thinking that he's now chancellor, and if they can hold a new election, I think he was overconfident about how much of the vote the Nazi Party could get. But I think he had realized, I didn't even talk about this, but in 1923 he had staged a coup called the Beer Hall Putsch, and he had served time in jail from that. And as a result of that, he really realized that in order to take over the government, the best route was politics, not violence. And so here I think he was really hoping that in the March 5th election, the Nazi Party would win a majority in the Reichstag. So he convinces Hindenburg to hold this election. Right away, February 3rd, he presents his Lebensraum program, which was his program that the Germans needed to expand their territory so there was more living room. That's what Lebensraum means, for the German people. In anticipation of the election, Hindenburg issued a presidential decree that banned political meetings and marches, restricted the press, gave police expanded powers of arrest. This was all, I think, at Hitler's request. And also, this was Hitler's attempt to win the election, get the majority of seats in the Reichstag on the 5th. Um, on February 21st, Goering set up auxiliary police forces that were made up of the SS and other militaristic groups who were then issued weapons and allowed to engage in basically violence that was under the auspices of the government. So this is all leading up to this March 5th election. But then on February 27th, 1933, the Reichstag building where the legislature met caught on fire. I'm going to take a sip of water. Um, there are videos of the Reichstag fire on the internet that you can find. It was a massive blaze. Um, I don't think we'll ever know for sure who set the blaze. There were people arrested for it. I'll talk about them later. There were rumors that the Nazis had set it themselves in order to create a political crisis. Regardless of who set the blaze, the result the next day was that the government used Article 48 to issue the Reichstag Fire Decree. So the Reichstag Fire Decree is sometimes referred to as the constitution of the Hitler dictatorship. It remained in force for the entire Hitler dictatorship, even though so did the Weimar Constitution. But because it was issued under Article 48, it took away all civil liberties, the right to assembly, free speech, free press. It took away the right to personal liberty, which was interpreted to allow what's called protective custody and preventive detention, which is they would say, oh, we think you're going to commit a crime, and so we're going to arrest you. And of course, it was used primarily to arrest political opponents. 25,000 individuals were arrested under this decree in the first 2 years. They were not charged with anything, and they were sent to the early concentration camps like Dachau. And again, this is before Jews were targeted specifically by the regime. It gave the government authority to overrule state and local laws. It replaced the life sentence with the death sentence. And in what became very common in the Nazi regime, it was named in a propagandist way, and it was called a defensive measure against communist acts of violence. And they basically said that the communists had set the fire and that the fire was basically the beginning of a communist uprising against the government. Okay, so that was February 28th. The March 5th election took place, and to Hitler's dismay, the Nazis only got 44% of the vote. So that was up from the 33% they had gotten in the previous election, but it wasn't enough for a majority. They combined with the German National Party, which was a right-wing conservative party, which had gotten 8% of the vote. And so they had a bare majority in the Reichstag. Then on March 24th, and again, like this is stunning, it's all within the first 2 months of Hitler being appointed chancellor, the Reichstag gathered and they adopted something called the Enabling Act, which also had a propaganda name, the law to remedy the distress of the people and the Reich. So what did that law do? Basically, the Reichstag voted itself out of existence. They transferred their legislative power to Hitler. They didn't dissolve themselves, but they basically said, here, you can do our job. You don't need our permission. We don't need to vote or anything. You can change the law. You can change the Constitution, and you can do it without permission by the Reichstag or the president. The laws can deviate from the Constitution, and they are effective the day after they're passed. This was a really, this was the beginning of the dismantling of the checks and balances of the German government. There is an entire story around the day that this was passed. Remember that they needed 2/3 of the Reichstag present to vote, and they needed 2/3 of the 2/3 that were present in order to amend the Constitution in this way to allow Hitler to exercise the legislative role. And so they were concerned, and so they arrested a lot of their political opponents. So they arrested 24 of the 120 Social Democrats, a bunch of the communists, um, and they then posted SS guards in the Reichstag, which was now meeting in a different building because the building had just burned. They met at a building that's not there anymore called the Kroll Opera House. Um, and so they both arrested their opponents, and they also had these really intimidating guys basically patrolling around inside the Reichstag while they voted on this. Um, the end of the story is it passed, but I think it's also important to note that the Social Democrat Party, which before the Weimar Constitution had been the majority party, they had 94 members in the Reichstag at the time, which the Reichstag at the time had 538 members, so they did not have a majority. Um, all 94 of them voted against it, and they also spoke against it on the floor of the Reichstag, which was really politically brave, and many of them were arrested and sent to concentration camps afterwards. Um, the next thing that happened was that the the they dissolved the Reichstag. Sorry, the next thing that happened was they dissolved the state parliaments. That was in January of 34. So they had eliminated basically the Reichstag, then the state governments. Then they abolished the Reichsrat on February 14th, 1934. And so now the only thing that's left that is a check on Chancellor Hitler's power is the president, von Hindenburg, who at this point was in his late 80s. Um, so Hitler knew better than to try to take over his position. And so he was basically in a waiting game for Hindenburg to die, and then he would be able to consolidate. In the meantime, he also consolidated his power in the Nazi Party through something called the Night of the Long Knives, or the Rome Purge, which you may have heard of. It was June 30th to July 2nd, 1934. And then the next day, the government issued a decree absolving Hitler and everyone else from any criminal liability for the murders that were committed, because it was a national emergency. Um, then on August 1st, the day before Hindenburg died, um, the a law was issued called the Law Re the Sovereign Head of the German Reich. It consolidated the office of the president with the office of chancellor, so Hindenburg and Hitler. Um, it then transferred authority for both from the president to the Fuhrer and Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler, and it was deemed effective on the day that Hindenburg died. They actually wrote that into the law, and then Hindenburg died the next day at the age of 86. So that was August 2nd, 1934. The basically the dictatorship was complete. Um, okay. The Then they began this process of what they called coordination, which is basically coordinating everything in life in Germany around the Nazi Party. Um, okay, so I managed to do that in, let's see, a half an hour. So the next section on anti-Jewish laws, I'll try and do in about 10 minutes, which is not going to do it anywhere near the justice it deserves. But let's just start with a reminder that Hitler became chancellor January of 1933. Reichstag fire was in February of 33. And the Enabling Act was March 24th of 1933. And Hitler's first action against the Jews was on April 1st, 1933. So this was clearly a very important part of his agenda, was his anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish actions. There was a huge boycott of Jewish businesses on April 1st. And among other things, they posted Nazi guards at the entrance to Jewish stores. They painted Jewish stars on Jewish stores. They put up posters that said, don't shop from Jews, shop from only German stores. And then they also posted photographers to catch pictures of any non-Jews who were actually violating the boycott and shopping at stores that were run by Jews. Um, there was actually a pretty big outcry against that. This is just a picture from Cleveland, which has a very large Jewish community. This was a response to the German boycott at Public Auditorium in Cleveland. You can see there were, the paper said 10,000 people attended. There were similar events in Madison Square Gardens. There was a protest down State Street in Chicago. So it was, widely protested. And Hitler actually walked it back a little bit, but continued with anti-Jewish decrees. Again, if I walked through all of these, it would take me 2 hours. Some of the big ones were on April 7th. All civil servants who were Jewish were fired. Also, politically unreliable civil servants were fired. So that included communists and others who would not take an oath of loyalty to Hitler. Um, there was an exception in these early laws, however, for basically anyone who had served in World War One, or had fought for Germany in World War One, or whose fathers or sons were killed in World War One. So even Jews who had served in World War One, or whose fathers and sons had been killed in World War One, they were not relieved of their jobs in this early decree of April 7th. On the same day, Jewish lawyers were kicked out of the profession, but with the same exception. And so the historians estimate that most lawyers were able to continue practicing. That something like 70% of all Jewish lawyers were allowed to continue practicing because so many of them had fought in World War One. There were tons of decrees throughout basically between 1933 and 1938, excluding Jews from particular professions, and they did them one at a time. So there's one on midwives, there's one on veterinarians, there's one on doctors, there's one on Jewish gun merchants. So you get the gist. They basically went one at a time through the professions, and this was consistent with their first effort against Jews, which was to economically basically segregate Jews and impoverish them. The second wave against Jews was to get them to immigrate. And of course, the third wave was to put them in ghettos and kill them. Jews were kicked out of institutions of higher education. That law in the propaganda way was called the Law Against Overcrowding in Schools and Institutions of Higher Education, which had a quota system for Jews. And so you see that kind of thing. Again, they went after political opponents first. So there was a law that allowed the government to confiscate the property of communists. So it was any assets or interests used or destined for the promotion of communistic activities. And so that allowed them to seize individuals' property. This later served as the basis for confiscating the property of Social Democrats and later Jews. And as you know, the Holocaust was not only a murderous rampage, it was also probably the biggest theft in history. And so these were the laws that served as the legal basis, and I use air quotes for that, for stealing the possessions of Jews and others. They also, then in 1935, you've probably heard of the Nuremberg race laws. Those laws were, there were two different statutes. One defined who was a citizen of the Reich and took away citizenship between Aryans and non-Aryans, and particularly Jews. And the other one prohibited marriage and extramarital sex relations between Jews and German nationals. That one, again, I can't help reading these names, was called the Law for the Protection of German Blood and Honor. These are called the Nuremberg Laws because they were adopted during one of the party congresses, the 1935 Party Congress, which was always held in Nuremberg, which was where the original putsch to take over the government in 23 had been. There were a series of regulations trying to define who was a Jew. In longer lectures, I go into this, but for this, I'll just say that it was a mix of religious definition and racial definition. So you could be a practicing Christian, but if you had three Jewish grandparents, you were considered a racial Jew. And you could be, um, have been born Christian with four Christian grandparents, but be a member of the Jewish community, and you were also deemed Jewish. Um, there was a 1938 census that required Jews to report their property. That also helped serve as the basis for confiscating property. Basically, anything, businesses, art, jewelry, personal property over a certain amount, all had to be reported. Um, then there was a decree that, so my maiden name is Lesser. There was a decree that required Jews who had non-Jewish names, whatever that means, to add Sarah as their middle name if they were a woman, or Israel as a middle name if they were a man. And this is actually a picture of the 1940 Berlin phone book. I looked up and blew up the page that had Lessers on it. And you can see Johanna is Jewish because she has Sarah as her middle name. Julius is not. Leo is. Lois is. Lutz is not. And Marguerite Sophie is Jewish. And so it was very easy to tell, even before the Jewish stars, who is Jewish. Jews had to have their passports stamped with a J. So there were just a ton of anti-Jewish laws. And again, mostly to isolate and economically impoverish Jews. All these laws had repercussions in civil law. So, for example, there's a case where a movie director had a contract with a studio to direct a film. He was Jewish. The studio filed a lawsuit to get out of the contract without being deemed to have breached the contract because the director was Jewish, and the court said that that was a legitimate reason to declare the contract null and void. It affected employment law, property law, landlord-tenant law, so it had lots of civil law repercussions. The first deportation of Jews was actually in October of 1938 when Jews with Polish passports were rounded up in one morning, October 28th, and dumped at the border of Germany and Poland. There was actually an international outcry, and so a lot of the trains that were taking these Jews to the Polish border ended up turning around, but a lot of Jews who had already been sent to Poland were integrated into Poland by the Jewish community after they spent a couple of years kind of stranded at the border. Uh, One of the families that was deported that you may have heard of was the family of Herschel Grienspan. Herschel Grienspan, he was living in Paris at the time, and his sister wrote him a letter. The Red Cross was actually at the border and helping people write letters to their families. He received this letter from his sister explaining that they had been dumped at the Polish border. And he was very distraught. He went to the German embassy and he shot the third highest person at the embassy, whose name was Ernst vom Rath. Ernst vom Rath died a couple days later, and the next thing that happened was Kristallnacht, November 9th and 10th of 1938. We now know that Kristallnacht was planned and was instigated by the government and by the Nazi Party. At the time, it was portrayed by the government as just an uprising by the people who were so shocked by this murder of Ernst vom Rath. Again, there is no time to really go through everything, but once Kristallnacht happened, it was almost impossible for Jews to get out of Germany. There were a couple reasons for that. One is that there were quotas in most countries, including in the United States. And our quotas came from an earlier statute from 1924. And again, that's a whole discussion of what our immigration laws were like. And then there were also people in the State Department who slow walked giving approvals for immigration. And so we actually underfilled our quotas during the 1933 to 38 time period when it was still possible for Jews to get out of Germany. After Kristallnacht, the anti-Jewish legislation picked up, or decrees, it's not really legislation. Um, Jewish businesses were closed. They were forcibly Aryanized, which meant they had to be sold for a nickel, no matter what they were worth, or just given to non-Jews. Jews were made to pay for the repairs from the damage from Kristallnacht. They were denied insurance coverage, and so things got a lot worse after Kristallnacht. And then by 1939, the estimate is that only 16% of Jewish breadwinners in Germany had a steady income. So, the economic isolation of Jews was complete. Um, Deportations, there was an attempt to allow Jews to immigrate. There was a conference called the Avian Conference. It went nowhere. Nobody really wanted to take the Jews. You probably all know about the voyage of the St. Louis, which was turned away at Havana and at the United States, and the passengers were sent back to Europe. Despite all that, over half of Germany's Jewish population did get out between 1933 and the start of the war in September 1939. Once the war started, things got even worse. Jews were required to live in Jew houses with other Jews. If you're ever interested in doing some genealogy, there's something called the German Minority Census Database, which is now searchable online. You can actually search for your relatives. It goes down to the street level in Germany. It was a census taken by the government, and they left those records behind. So it's a really great way to find out where your relatives were if they were in Germany at the time. At the same time, as this anti-Jewish stuff, the German government was also starting the T4 program, which put to death disabled individuals. That was the first use of gas to kill people before it was used to kill Jews. The Jewish Star Ordinance came in September of 41, and then deportation started in October of 41. I'm not going to focus as much on this because I think this is the part of the story that most people know more about. But, Jews were basically shipped initially to ghettos where they were crammed in, not enough food, plentiful disease. And then from those ghettos, they were usually shipped to the death camps. And then later on, people were shipped directly to the death camps. At the same time, Germany was expanding through the war and bringing its anti-Jewish laws to all the territories it conquered. And there is actually a collection of those laws by Raphael Lemkin, who came up with the word genocide, who was a Polish Jew during World War II. He actually cataloged all the anti-Jewish laws. And at the same time, some of the countries that were either independent or allies of Germany also engaged in anti-Jewish laws. So like Italy, Romania, Vichy France, also a whole topic that I won't get deeply into here. At the end of the war, this is the best guess we have of basically what the outcome was. And as you can see, and you all know this already, the majority of the Jewish population in most countries was put to death. Okay, so now I'm going to try and do lawyers and judges in 5 minutes. I do want to say, and again, this is a whole bunch of stuff, but the world knew or had inklings of this starting in 1941. And so if anybody's interested in that, I can talk about that a little more during the Q&A part. So lawyers, judges, and courts in Germany, they weren't exactly like our courts, but you went to law school, you took a bar exam, and you took an oath to uphold the Constitution. So under the Weimar Republic, this top one was the oath to the Constitution that attorneys took. I swear loyalty to the Constitution, obedience to the law, and conscientious fulfillment of the duties of my office, so help me God. On August 20th, which was less than 2 weeks after Hindenburg died and Hitler became Fuhrer, he changed the oath to, I swear I will be true and obedient to the Fuhrer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, observe the law and conscientiously fulfill the duties of my office, so help me God. So it was a big change in what was expected of lawyers. Before before Hitler's dictatorship, the regular courts were structured very similar to our courts. There was a Supreme Court that sat in Leipzig, district courts of appeal, district courts under that, and then local courts, which were probably akin to our small claims courts. These courts continued to function during the entire Third Reich, and they even issued some opinions that were not very helpful for Jews. So there's an opinion that I teach to my law students, interpreting the Nuremberg laws in terms of what kind of sexual conduct is a violation of the Nuremberg laws. And it reads like any statutory interpretation case that you might read today from, from any court. Um, they also tried the Reichstag fire defendants. They actually found four of them not guilty and one guilty, and that led to the creation of the People's Court, which I'll talk about in a moment. One of the things Hitler did was create these three extraordinary courts. And in the opening statement of the NMT justice trial, so the IMT, the International Military Tribunal, was the first Nuremberg trial, and you've probably all heard about that. That was the one with Goering, and if you saw the movie Nuremberg, which was really a great movie that just came out, that was the IMT. But then there were actually subsequent trials in Nuremberg that were held by the United States, and Telford Taylor, in the opening trial of the Jurist trial, said the most crucial and radical change in the judicial system under the Third Reich was the establishment of various extraordinary courts. These irregular tribunals permeated the entire judicial structure and eventually took over all judicial business, which touched political issues or were related to the war. So the first one created was the Special Court, which was basically a court to deal with anti-Nazi activities. There were three judges and no appeal from those courts. The next one that was created was the Hereditary Health Court, which was to make decisions on sterilization of people with hereditary diseases. The types of diseases covered expanded from the original founding of the court to include eventually being Jewish and some other things. Again, that's a whole lecture all by itself. And then the People's Court was absolutely off the wall. And the chief judge of the court was a guy named Roland Freisler. And if you go online, you can see he actually was the judge in the case of the people who tried to assassinate Hitler in 1944, Stauffenberg and his folks. And Freisler just yelled from the bench. He got coined as Raving Roland, didn't let those he was inquiring answer anything. And it was structured in the following way. There were five judges, two of whom were lay judges, and three who were appointed from the SS, the armed forces, or the Nazi party. So it was, this was the court that tried the White Rose Group and pretty much any political trials. Okay, so I think I will stop there and see what questions we have.
Awesome. Thank you, Cathy. That was
A
incredible. And I
tour, a
do
huge tour, yeah.
Well, that gives us time for some really good questions that are interested in the specifics. And I see one really good one that just came in that I think is a great place to start. And this comes from Carol asking, in rural Germany, for example, in a town, a small German town, were the laws changed according to federal German laws, or could they operate a bit independently, in how they treated Jews? So, essentially, how did small towns and rural areas act maybe differently or in accordance with these federal mandates?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I don't actually know the answer, although given the dismantling of the state government systems, I don't think there would have been a lot of tolerance for variance at the local level. But and there were Nazi Party members, kind of all throughout the country. But I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Well, it's always fun to start with one that stumps you. And there's a question that goes
Every
alongside
time.
that that, I don't know, maybe you know the answer to it or you don't know, because it struck me as I was listening to you talk, that every time you have to change laws to mandate behavior, you assume that part of that is because people won't do that thing automatically. You have to mandate the behavior because people aren't acting in that way. So I was wondering, with all of these changes, how often were ordinary Germans actually fully complying with these laws? How often were they fully on board with, I'm no longer going to shop at Jewish businesses, I'm no longer going to
Yeah.
do this thing or that thing? What sort of, not even resistance, but just sort of people ignoring the laws did you see on the ground as these laws changed?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things they did, like the law for the Nuremberg race laws that were on German blood and honor, one of the provisions of that was that German women below, I think it was 45, weren't allowed to work for a Jewish household, which of course perpetrates this idea of Jews as sexual predators. But there was a delayed implementation of that. And so I think they were very careful to make sure that the laws that they were passing were not going to impact Aryans, the people that they wanted to be sort of part of their greater society. And to the extent they did, they would actually kind of soften the blow. And there was great financial gain to be had from these laws if you were not one of the targeted groups. So, for example, there have been lawsuits. There was one that just went to the Supreme Court that the plaintiffs lost, but over a jurisdictional issue, where someone had Christian sacramental, I don't even know what they're called. It's called the Gulf Treasure. Part of it had been sold to the Cleveland Art Museum at a legitimate price. And then the Jewish owners were forced to sell the remainder of the collection to a buyer at, pennies on the dollar. And so, regular Germans benefited economically from stuff like that. When Jews were kicked out of their nice apartments, regular Germans benefited from that. If you had a Jewish doctor and you were used to your Jewish doctor, I suppose, maybe you'd had to change to a different doctor. But I don't think that they were very careful not to have these laws really impact the daily lives of the people they didn't want impacted. If you were gay, if you were black, if you were Jewish, if you were a communist, a social democrat, if you were, a political rabble rouser, then you were not, they didn't care what happened to you.
Mhm. It's interesting the way that if people are benefiting financially or at least not having their ordinary lives affected, how many of these laws probably passed with them even without them even really thinking about it because it
Well, and
affects
again,
them.
remember, past is just a signature because the
Yeah.
legislature wasn't working anymore. So there was no way to, call your representative and say, please don't approve, blah, 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 because the Reichstag only met, I think, like 8 or 9 times after the Enabling Act, and only when Hitler needed it for show. And there
Mhm.
were some subsequent elections I didn't talk about where there were only Nazis on the ballot anyway. So, the whole Reichstag was just window dressing.
Mhm.
So there was really no way to oppose it. I think people were probably scared too. People of conscience were scared because you could go from being one of those protected Germans to being arrested for no reason under the protective custody or preventive detention, which was allowed by the Reichstag fire decree. And so if you caused too much trouble, you could be thrown into Dachau or one of the early concentration camps.
Right. Well, and that goes to a question that somebody else asked about, when historians say Jewish people, not Jewish people, sorry, German people just watched and let this happen. Like, do you agree? Is there anything that Germans of conscience could have done without endangering their own families or in their own lives? How constrained were they really?
I mean, there were many brave people who did something to, protect or to protest. But a lot of them ended up, being arrested. Uh, you know, there were the Lutheran minister whose name I'm blanking on right now, Friedrich Niemöller, was protesting from the pulpit. um, people were, I think the way people resisted, and I think we're seeing this now in our community, was by, hiding one person or bringing groceries to one person. For the opera that I wrote, I did a lot of research of like, diaries and things, contemporaneous writings by individuals. And people would do things like their apartment would get bombed and they would say that their passport was in there but they would have taken their passport out and they would give it to a Jew. So,
Mm,
I think that resistance on the meta level was quite dangerous. And so instead you had private acts of resistance.
right. Um, okay, well, so two quick questions to wrap up, and then I will talk about our next What History Teaches program. Kathy, if people have additional questions or are interested in further resources, what is the best way to get in contact with you? That's question number one. And then the other one is, can you just repeat the database of census information that you talked about? Because I see a lot of people who are really interested in some genealogy.
Sure. Actually, if you wouldn't mind talking about the follow-up programs while let's see if can I access the
Yeah,
rest.
no, we can do that. Okay, so while Kathy is accessing some information to share with everyone who's interested in learning more, I am going to talk about our next What History Teaches program, which will take place on Tuesday, May 5th at noon Central Time. And in this session, Dr. Carrie Tabor, who is a professor at the University of Arkansas Fort Smith, will speak about the Holocaust and about collaboration in Eastern Europe. And I know we've had some questions today about what people in Germany could do to help Jews, to what extent they were collaborating with the Nazi government. So this program is going to focus on collaboration in the East and specifically in Lithuania. And Professor Carrie Tabor, as an adult, found out that her grandfather, who she was very close with, was a wanted Lithuanian war criminal who had been part of the Lithuanian Auxiliary Police, who played a role during the Holocaust in the extermination of the Jewish people. And so in this program, she's going to talk about collaboration in that area. She's going to talk about the role of the Lithuanian Auxiliary Police. She's going to talk about some psychological and social aspects that led ordinary people like her grandfather to collaborate with the Nazis. And of course, she will talk about her own story of being related to someone who was a collaborator. So it's going to be a very interesting personal program, but also just a really interesting program and talking about the Holocaust in the East and about reasons that ordinary people can collaborate. So definitely make sure to attend that May 5th at noon Central Time. And Kathy, do you have some resources that
I,
you want to share?
okay, the database, thank you for giving me that time.
Yeah.
The database web address is Mapping the Lives, Mapping Lives, lives.org. And my email address is very long. So I don't know if you have a way can you put it in the chat or
I
can
can put it
I,
in the
I can
chat.
put it in the chat. There we go. Except that only goes to hosts.
It should go to everyone now.
Okay, so it's oh, you said it so I can,
Yes.
nope, it's not doing that.
If you send it to me, I can send it to
Okay.
everyone.
And then I will say that I am happy to come talk at synagogues and yeah, so please do get in touch. I'm hoping I'm doing this right. Okay, there's my email.
Okay, and I will share this with everybody very quickly. And if you still were not able to write down the information about the census data quick enough, this recording will go up on our AHEC YouTube, and it will also go on our website, which is ahecinfo.org. So those are all places where you can access this again if you want to go back over all the information that Kathy has talked about, if you want to look into that census data. So please do watch the recording, share it with friends and family. There is tons of great information in here and some additional resources. Thank you so much, Kathy. This was an amazing program. I learned so much from you. I know everybody else did too. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions with the time constraints, but those additional resources should help. Thank you everyone for joining us, and we hope to see you at the next program. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.